Hey guys, and welcome to Life Guided Setup. Last we left off at ServiceNow Fundamentals 102. In that blog, we talked about getting a instance from the developer.servicenow portal and managing the instance, and then we dive straight into the UI of the instance, talking about some of the applications that we have available to us. We also talked about the filter navigator, navigating through all of your applications, assigning favorites to applications, and then reviewing your history. Then we started getting to something a little bit more complicated, which was the guided setup. It talks about going through the ITSM guided setup provided by ServiceNow. The first portion is the company. This is where you define how your ServiceNow instance is going to look like, your company name, giving it a theme, and a color palette. And then you have your welcome pages. These are the landing pages the users are first visited by when they go to your ServiceNow instance. And then you have connectivity. This talks about email properties, inbound, outbound email configurations, LDAP, SSO, and things of that nature. Now we're going to go into essentially the ServiceNow Fundamentals 103, where we talk about foundation data. Now we're going to go into the guided setup, ITSM guided setup. And essentially where we left off is here, foundation data. Now, what is foundation data? Foundation data is pre-existing data that you guys may have in your company, whether it be in a database somewhere, whether it is in Excel files, CSV files, however you're storing it, it's somewhere existing in your environment. And this foundations data is data that's going to be used throughout the ITSM platform. And some of that data is going to consist of departments, locations, companies, users, groups, group members, and then assignment roles. Now, users, groups, group members, and assignment roles, typically this data will come from an Active Directory server that you may have, and that data can be extracted either through an LDAP pull, or if you do not have LDAP integration set up, you can export the AD information and then import it into ServiceNow through Excel sheets, if you so wish to do so. Now, let's start with department data. Departments, we're going to hit configure, and immediately right off the bat, what it brings us to is an import set. So an import set is essentially where you select either a file or data source that's going to feed information to a temporary table that is created within ServiceNow. Then on that temporary table, a transform map is applied to it, which is a one-to-one mapping for the columns in the temporary table to the columns in your intended target table. And what we have available to us is we can either choose a file. This is either a CSV or Excel file, some kind of delimited file, or we can go through a data source. The data source is whether we're hosting a CSV file externally on an FTP server. We can access it via either SSL or non-SSL, a tab-based CSV, HTML, pointing to a CSV, JDBC to a MySQL connection, JDBC to Oracle, LDAP, as I was talking about earlier. So there is a plethora of data sources, and we can actually define our own data sources. However, the import set is not always the fastest way to get data within ServiceNow. So we're going to use both ways, but first let's talk about the department table itself. So if we open the department table here, these are the preloaded ones, and I already have these in an Excel format. So I'm going to delete these real quick, and we're going to bring them back once with a standard import and once with an import set. There we go. All right. So if we create a new department, it's going to prompt us for a name, an ID, a description, a department head, and then a primary contact. Department head, if we look at it and we discern from the URL, this is pointing to the users table, sysuser underscore list. So it's letting us pick from the sysusers table whoever the head of that department is. And then similarly for the primary contact, it will also point to the sysuser table. These are called reference fields. And we're going to get into talking about what information you need to point correctly through an import to reference fields a little bit later. So now, instead of going in one by one, me entering in all of my departments, the fastest way is if your data follows the same format that ServiceNow hosts this data, or if you can easily manipulate your existing Excel, CSV files, or however you have the data to match ServiceNow's format, then this way is going to be a lot quicker than an import set. So right now, what we're going to do is up here where you see the columns, in between the columns in the white area, so not up here, but in between the columns, we're going to right click, we're going to go import, and then before we do anything, we're going to want to create an Excel template. And then we're going to download that template. And then let's take a look at the template. So the first page of the Excel sheet is basically directions on how to import data into ServiceNow. I'm going to walk you guys step by step through this, so we don't really have to go too much in depth into it. And then if we go to page 1, we see a list of the available columns that we want to import on for that department table. As you can see, we have the department head, the description, the ID, the name, and the primary contact. Now, some of the columns that were hidden from us on the form were the parent, the company, the cost center, and the headcount. We can modify the form to show these, or we can leave them hidden, and we can even add more fields to this table if we want. Now I'm going to close this because I already have an export of the original ones that were there. And I'm going to choose the file. that I want to import. And let's show you actually this file before we import it. So it's the same data that we saw earlier. We have the name, ID, the department head, the description, and then some of the other fields. Now let's close this. I'm going to hit upload. And now what it does is it goes through the Excel sheet and it reads the columns at the top in row 1, and it discerns based on the column label that is written here. It matches it to a column label on that table, and then for each row it inserts, because over here we had left it at insert. If you wanted to update the data, in other words, if the data is already existing in your ServiceNow instance and you merely want to update it, we would have selected the update radio button. Since we didn't have any data because we just deleted it, we wanted to insert it. So now when we hit preview data, as we can see here, there are no error messages. So that means that the data has been processed successfully. Now, for us to complete the import, we must select complete import down here. And now, as we can see in the departments table, again, we have the rows that were already there prior. Now, the secondary method to doing this is, I'm going to go ahead and delete these again. Secondary method is via import sets. So we're going to go to import sets, and we're going to go to load data. Now this was the screen that you saw earlier that the ITSM guided setup took us through. So what we're going to do is we're going to call this departments. And I'm just going to postfix it with IS to know that it is an import set. And the source of the import is going to be a file. And keep in mind, with a import set, you can actually have your data on different sheets and it start at different rows. So for our sake, if we open this, we are on sheet 1 and our headers are in row 1. So we're going to leave this as sheet 1, headers, row 1. And we're going to choose the same file. And then we're going to hit submit. All right, so now it has loaded the data, but we still need to create what's called a transform map. A transform map is a one-to-one mapping solution for each column. So in the new table that it just created, U_department_IS, we need to point every field in that table to every field in the department table. So we're going to go ahead and create a transform map for it by clicking on the link there. And we're going to call this department transform map. And the source table is automatically filled out from the import set that we had. And then the target table, this is where we search it is the CMN underscore department. Alrighty. And then I'm going to go ahead and submit this. And then we're going to go to that transform map. Department transform map. And now these are where we have to actually map the fields. So there's one of two ways to map the fields. We can either go here in the related list, we can click new, and we can select from the available fields in the source fields. And let's say company. And then in the target field, we can select which target field it matches with, and that's going to be company. Now, in our case, because we already mapped the data to the same column labels as ServiceNow in our Excel sheet, there is a really easy auto mapping tool that we can use. So if we go back and just disregard this, we can actually use auto map matching fields. And what that does is it is in your import set, in your table, in your source table, any table column that matches the target table column, it will automatically map those together. This can be very powerful to quickly finish a transform map. However, if you were not careful in the naming conventions of your column labels during the creation of your source table, this can misidentify a map. And then there's another option which is called mapping assist. And mapping assist is essentially you'll have two slush buckets. So if we select company and then company, we've mapped these together. And we can go on with cost center. And then we can add cost center and so forth. So this is a slightly faster way of manually mapping. And let's go back. And I'm going to go ahead and hit auto map matching fields because I am very confident that the fields that I want match exactly the target table fields. Alright, so now as you can see in the related list, it has auto mapped 10 fields for us. So I'm going to go ahead and update this transform map. Alright, and then let's go back to that import set that we loaded. So we loaded this import set right here, and we can order it by the created date to see. And now the import set has been loaded, but it has not been imported. So we're going to go ahead and hit transform on the import set. This is the import set selected. And here is a list of the selected transform map. On the left side, if you had multiple transform maps that pointed to that source table, you will have an available set of transform maps, and then you can select one of many and move it over. And then we can select transform. And then because there was only 10, it processes them fairly quickly. So now, as we can see, the state is complete and the completion code is success. So if we go back to that department, we can see that those rows have again been imported and processed. Now you're thinking to yourself, why would I use an import set over just the standard right click and import? There's one of many ways or reasons, to use a import set with a transform map over just a standard import in ServiceNow. The first reason and most obvious one is your company data that's hosted in your Excel sheets or other data sources, 99.9% of the time will not be mapped to the same exact column names as ServiceNow. However, sometimes it is easier to map it out in an Excel sheet than it is to do it in a transform map. Now, the reason I say that is, yes, a transform map is reusable. However, most people's data is so separated and can have so many layers of separations that it may be easier in ServiceNow to perform in Excel to perform a couple of VLOOKUPs, or if you have it in a different data source, like a database, you can create a database view that emulates the ServiceNow table structure, and that might be a lot quicker than actually creating those transform maps. Now, what are the benefits of a transform map? Well, a transform map is very powerful. So when your data needs to also be altered, you can run a script on the transform map. Let me show you what I mean. So we're going to open this department's transform maps, and here in transform scripts, we can actually create a transform script that runs during the transformation. Now, we have available to us a couple of variables. Source is the rows within the source table that the import set has been created. Target is the target table that those rows are going to be inserted in. Map is that transform map, the mapping of the variables and their order and things of that nature. And then log allows you to log errors during the transform script portion. Now, a really powerful use case for this is as you're inserting data, you can run scripts that can call script includes. You can define new glide records in here, glide systems, and then with that, you can have kind of a cascading effect. For example, if you wanted to insert a couple of incident records, however, in your incident records, as you're inserting them in, you do not have the appropriate departments to assign the records to in your ServiceNow instance. So as you're importing those incident records, you can have a transform script running at the same time, assigning those incident tickets in the target table to a brand new department, utilizing either a script include that creates a reusable script for this, or calling a glide record directly into the department table and then setting that department to the sysid of that new department, that record that you created. So there is a lot of functionality in the transform scripts. The standard import method in ServiceNow is a lot easier to use, but you don't have this functionality. Now, when importing data into ServiceNow, there's a couple of things to look out for. And we're going to show you those in the departments table. So when you import something into any table, whether it be the department, incident, user, whatever the table may be, when you have a choice list, a list, or a reference field, be very careful that in your data source or Excel sheet or CSV sheet, whatever the case may be, that you are pointing to the value and not the label of that field. Now, what I mean by that is, for this department head, this is a reference to the user table. And if I click on this lookup list, okay, right now, when I select a user, the value that it is pointing to for this reference field is the name. It is not the first name, it is not the last name or the email, it is the actual name, the full name, which is first space last. Now, you can change which value that it points to, because when you're importing, especially when you're pointing against the user table, there hasn't been a company that I've worked at that doesn't have two people in their user table that have the same first and last name. Now, the user table, its indexes on the user ID property right here. However, because the value that we're pointing to in this reference is the name, we can have two able tutors, two John Does. And how we can change this is if we go to that user table, and I'll leave this, and we right click, configure table. Now, the field that you are selecting on for those reference is the display field. So right now, by default, the name will be automatically the display field. However, because that is not a unique field, what I recommend is just during your import process, select something that you know for sure is unique. So we know for sure the user ID is unique. So we're going to hit true on that display. We're going to hit right click, save, or update either way. And then if we go back to the department, so now you saw when I selected Able Tutor, now the field right here shows his user ID able.tutor. So now when I'm importing my field in the import in that Excel sheet, so let's open this. Desktop. Blog 103. So right here, created by no, department head. So right here we have the names: Rob, Fred, Natasha, David, Mariano, and so forth. But now, if I try to import, this will fail. It won't point to the correct department head. I need their user IDs. So I can change that in the Excel sheet by pulling their user IDs and essentially replacing those Excel values to their user IDs, and it will work. The reason I'm doing this is because, again, like I said, you can have multiple users with the same first and last name, and then you're going to run into errors where it's either A, assigning it to the wrong person, or it will just completely fail and you'll get an error message in your import. So let's go back to the user table and let's change it to the way it was. So right click, configure table, and I'm going to set this back to false and then update. Now, similar in a choice field, which is essentially a drop down. A choice field is comprised of a label and a value. Now, when you're importing, you're always importing with the value, not the label. So make sure that you're writing the value down. Also, there is a list column type, which is essentially like a reference, but it points to multiple references. And with that, you have to make sure that you're pointing to the display name of those references, not whatever field you believe may be the default. So always double check in that table configurations to what display equals to true has been set. And those are some of the caveats to look out for while you're importing. And those caveats are both there for the standard importing and using the ServiceNow import sets and transform maps. So this concludes the importing of the foundation data. Going through the rest of that guided setup, if we look through foundation data, the process is going to be literally the same for department, locations, companies, etc. Now, some things to keep in mind: it's easier to normalize your data before putting it in ServiceNow. There are some methods that you can use in ServiceNow to normalize your data, and having normalized data is absolutely key to running accurate analytical reports against your system. Because if your data is not normalized, your reports are going to be extremely messy and extremely inaccurate. Now, there is a plugin in ServiceNow that's called Field Normalization. You can run that, configure it, and then create normalization rules against a field within a table, and it will intercept any new row, whether it's either via a transform map or via a standard import, and it will prevent you from inserting duplicate data. Another method is creating a coalesce field on your table configurations, which is like a composite key essentially in a database terms. And what that does is it prevents you from inserting duplicate data as well. The third method that only works with transform maps is if you have a script include that checks for duplicate data and normalizes your transformation. You can actually call that import script, that script include in your transformation script, and it will validate your transformation before you insert it. So that's another method of doing that. But again, I highly recommend you normalize your data before attempting to import it into ServiceNow. And that concludes this lesson.